to the HAI Weekly Research Seminar. My name is Patrick Hines. I'm Senior Manager for Research Communities at HAI. And today I am delighted to introduce my colleague Nestor Maslach, who will be presenting an overview of the 2025 AI Index. The 2025 AI Index report provides unbiased, rigorously vetted, and globally sourced data for policymakers, researchers, journalists, executives, and the general public to develop a deeper understanding of the complex field of artificial intelligence. The AI Index, which is led by a steering committee of influential AI thought leaders, is the world's most comprehensive report on trends in AI. This 2025 report covers AI trends related to research and development, technical performance, technical AI ethics, the economy, education, policy and governance, diversity and public opinion, and we're delighted to be able to share more from the index with you today.
Awesome, thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here. We obviously work on putting the AI Index out every single year to inform policymakers, business leaders, people like yourself about what's actually going on with this technology. And I mean, I think I really just have one goal here today, which is to just put all of you guys in a position to have some really clever things to say about trends in AI. When you're going to be at the next dinner table or at a bar and the topic of AI comes up, you'll be talking about how much performance improved on one benchmark, how much investment is going through the roof, and you'll be armed to really kind of knock people's socks off with some data about AI trends. Now, what is the AI Index? So the AI Index is an annual report. It comes out of the University of Stanford, and it's currently in its 8th edition, and it's a report that really aims to track, distill, and visualize key information on trends in artificial intelligence. And it was put together in 2017 by a diverse committee of AI thought leaders, people like Jack Clark, who's one of the co-founders of Anthropic, Eric Brynjolfsson, who I would say is one of the world's leading AI economists, James Manica, who's one of the leaders of AI research activities at Google. And these influential thought leaders, they got together because they understood as far back as 2017 that AI was going to be a game-changing technology, and that as such, it was going to be valuable to have a report that could really concretely tell a story. Let me maybe close my Slack. You don't want to see that. Yeah, that's one of the challenges, honestly, of giving these presentations. I've now done them a few times, and there's a few jokes that roll really nicely off the tongue, but there's a few people in the audience who have heard this presentation once or twice. So I feel bad saying the same jokes to that kind of crowd. So we're going to have to mix it up today. I may have, in fact, asked ChatGPT to kind of pepper some comedy into the presentation today. But in terms of the kind of committee, so these guys got together, they understood very early on that AI was going to be a transformative tech, and they wanted to create a resource that could really tell a story of what's going on. We're led this year by our chair, Ray Perot, who's in the audience, has done a phenomenal job of kind of leading the initiative. Also worth mentioning that we collaborate with a lot of researchers at Stanford, also outside of Stanford, some of which are in the room today. It's really a team effort and a team initiative. Also want to give a special shout out to Laura Donna, who's in the audience as well. She has made every single chart that you're going to see today, and there are a lot of charts in the index. And what you may not know is that, we have one final chart that appears in the PDF, but there's probably 5 or 6 versions that come before, so you do the math there. Now, in terms of how we actually work to get the index off the ground, we collaborate with a variety of stakeholders, data vendors that give us data. We, of course, collect data ourselves for some topics. And we're really privileged over the years to occupy a very influential position in the AI thought leadership ecosystem. We've been cited by newspapers across the globe, by governments and government agencies across the globe, and we've increasingly briefed business leaders across the globe. And I think, to me, what this is really reflective of is the fact that we're now at a moment in the ecosystem where AI is really here. It's a tool that we're all using. It's impacting all of our lives. And we need to think, whether we're in parliaments or in boardrooms or just at the kitchen table, how we want to interact with this technology. And that's really what we try to do at the Index, give people data to understand how to think about this tech. Now, The AI index itself is close to 500 pages long. And I think I wrote most of the 500 pages. And of course, it would be my dream if all of you guys would read the report front to back many times. But I realize we're kind of, stressed for time. Perhaps a bit alarmingly, people have been informing me that these days people throw the AI index into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT to kind of generate a summary. So, we still believe in human-centeredness here at Stanford. So we're going to have a human give you the summary of the report, the top takeaways for you guys to understand. Now, first and foremost is just the fact that AI performance is continuing to improve. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, we didn't need to go to Stanford for a guy to tell me that AI is getting better, but we'll tell you in some of the specific ways it's getting better. I like to start these presentations with an image because I think it really puts into perspective just how much better the tech has gotten. One of the things that we did is we asked Midjourney, one of the world's leading text-to-image generators, to give us a hyper-realistic image of Harry Potter over time. And we asked each version of Midjourney this question, from the first version that came out in February of 2022, all the way to one of the more recent versions. Now, this slide juxtaposes just how much better the image generation has gotten in the last 2 years. Now, if I was deciding, for example, which one of these to put in my living room, I might honestly go with the one on the left. I think it looks a lot more inspired. It's kind of a Pablo Picasso take on a tortured Harry Potter. Things have gone very bad for Harry in that photo. But of course, we asked for hyperrealism, and that's kind of what you get with the image on the right. And perhaps on a more relatable level, we're kind of now at moments in the ecosystem where you could go to websites like whichfacesreal.com. These are things we cite in the index, and it will give you an image of a real human, and it will give you image of a generated human. And just out of curiosity, who here in the audience thinks that it's the image on the left that is the real one? Hands up. Who here thinks that it's the image on the right that's the real one? So kind of a 50-50, and it is in fact the image on the left that is real. And it's an interesting exercise to go on this site because you could really get a sense and a perspective of just how much better this tech has gotten. And we do these exercises with the index where in previous years we have asked the index, let's see how language models perform over time. We have asked the index, let's see how these image generators perform over time. One of the things that we did this year is we looked at video generation. And one of the things that we asked these video generators to do was to give us a video of Will Smith eating pasta. This became a bit of an internet meme. We love memes at the index, trying to keep up with Gen Z and the kids. And Will Smith eating pasta, that became a very big meme that people were trying to get AI systems to generate. And this was basically a year and a half ago. This is the generation that you got when you asked AI systems that particular question. Now, if you flip the script and you look at October 2024, so this is a subsequent version, you see, some improvement, but also some kind of comedy in this particular image. It does seem to be a little bit better. There's actually pasta, but the pasta seems to be levitating into Will Smith's mouth over here. And then the final generation, the more recent one that we've cited, which was in February of 2025, this is probably the best one yet. Will Smith is smiling. He's had a great, spaghetti bolognese there. It seems to be moving into his mouth, but not levitating, which is good. But also, he looks a little less like Will Smith, and I wonder if there's a potential copyright thing going on there. But again, illustrating just how much better the tech has gotten, and it's useful to kind of see some of these tangible examples before we actually get into some of the concrete data. Now, that's how the tech has gotten better as a whole. It's worth talking about some of the things that we've seen recently with the technology. One of the big stories in 2024 is the rise of paradigms like test time compute. This is, again, something that OpenAI inaugurated with its O1 model, models that are capable of iteratively reasoning. And these models, in comparison to other models like GPT-4, which don't do this iterative reasoning, do a lot better on a lot of intellectual tasks, but especially the tasks that require high-level reasoning like AMY 2024, which is a high-level mathematics competition. And it's not just the case when you look at the technological developments of better language models. 2024 was a phenomenal year for AI in science. This particular chart is looking at how well AlphaFold 3 predicts protein ligand docking in comparison to other methods. This is just basically looking at how well do they predict protein structures. And AlphaFold 3, of course, was one of the models that was rewarded, so to speak, with a Nobel Prize in chemistry. There was also a Nobel Prize in physics that was given in 2024 for AI, and a Turing Award as well, a very important award in the computer science community that was given towards work in reinforcement learning. Now, in the world of AI, there always seems to be kind of new buzzwords that are thrown around. Agentic and agentic AI seem to be one of them in 2024. We profiled AI agents a little bit in the index, and one of the things that we found was that agentic AI is something that is starting to show promise, but we're still perhaps far off from having some kind of helpful office assistant that could do all our work for us. Now, one of the challenges with agents is that it's just, it's hard very often to evaluate what they can actually do. You've had new benchmarks that have been introduced like Rebench. These are benchmarks that look at how well AI systems can do computer science tasks that involve agentic capabilities. And basically, one of the things that they found is that when you give these systems very short time budgets, so if you need a task done under 2 hours, they tend to do a lot better than humans. But naturally, when you kind of expand the horizon of the time budget, humans tend to do a lot better. And of course, it's very interesting to see AI systems generate text, generate images, but agentic workflows tend to be a little bit more complicated and a little bit more advanced. Now, where does that leave us when it comes to AIs actually getting better and the performance improving? Now, this chart is actually not from this year's AI index, it's from last year's AI index. But I like to show it because it really puts into perspective how things have improved. On this chart, what you're seeing is the performance of AI systems on a variety of different benchmarks over time in comparison to a human baseline. So you'll see that for benchmarks like ImageNet, for benchmarks like Superglue, a lot of these AI systems are already exceeding the performance of humans. Now, when I did this presentation last year, I kind of talked about the fact that there's still a few benchmarks on the far right, like math, where AI systems aren't kind of beating humans. But if you flip the script and you look at an updated version of this chart this year, you'll notice that a lot of these super challenging benchmarks that were designed to really push these AI systems, they've been kind of toppled in a lot of ways. And the story here is not only one of AI capabilities improving, but it's also one of the pace of improvement. So this benchmark that you see on the left side, the line in blue, that is the benchmark for ImageNet, created, of course, by Dr. Fei-Fei Li, one of the co-founders of Stanford High. And it took AI researchers a good 4 years to get from models that could go from 90% relative to the human baseline all the way to exceeding that benchmark. And that benchmark, for reference, was just a benchmark that looked at how well systems could classify images. Could they tell you this is a dog, this is a cat, et cetera, et cetera. This benchmark, one of the benchmarks on the far right, the benchmark in teal, this is a benchmark for competition-level mathematics. And we have gotten systems that scored roughly 10% relative to the human baseline, all the way to exceeding that baseline in pretty much 2 years. And the performance reference for that particular benchmark is the performance of a 3-time International Math Olympiad gold medalist. So it's not like I'm sitting at home and they're testing these models against me, someone that still has nightmares about grade 12 calculus. They're testing them against systems that actually, or humans that really understand math. And this really kind of illustrates the tremendous progress of these systems. And in 2023, in last year's AI Index, we talked about how there were all these new benchmarks like GPQA, MMMU, and SWE-bench that were introduced to really challenge and push these systems. And we've seen massive performance improvements on a lot of these benchmarks. And we're kind of now getting to the point where some of these new benchmarks or tests that have been introduced to challenge AI systems are literally being branded as humanity's last exam, as if there is going to be no more academic tests for actually testing these systems and seeing what they actually can do. Now, of course, that's a little bit hyperbolic, but the point remains that this is where we seem to be at in the benchmarking ecosystem. But again, the landscape evolves quickly. This chart we published in the AI index for this benchmark. And this screenshot I took yesterday of the humanities last exam leaderboard. And you'll notice that while the top score here is close to 9%, we now have models that are scoring up to 20%. So the pace of improvement is really going through the roof on a lot of these benchmarks and tests. But I think it's important to acknowledge as well, where do we go with benchmarks and what do we do with benchmarks? Of course, at the AI index, one of the fundamental things that we've always been doing is trying to understand how we can evaluate these systems. And usually we do that by looking at these kinds of tests of AI capabilities. Now, as I've talked to you, most of these benchmarks are seeing saturation. And there are some issues with these benchmarks, which we reported on in this year's AI index. We cited work from Ankur Royal, who was the co-author of the report and the leader on the RAI chapter. And they've done work which kind of looks at actually how good are a lot of these benchmarks, and point to the fact that some of these benchmarks suffer from contamination issues where data that they are tested on, they see in their training, which potentially biases the results. There's also issues of factual inaccuracy where the developers, they tend to report benchmark scores, but then when third parties actually test the models on these benchmarks, they find differential scores. And in some cases, we just have benchmarks that saturate very, very quickly. So we have to start thinking to ourselves, how do we actually find a way to use benchmarks that are useful for the community and that can inform us what we do with AI? And perhaps more saliently, as I illustrated with some of these tasks like agentic AI and robotics, those tasks don't necessarily lend themselves that easily to benchmarking because they're much more complex, much more multi-fluid. It's easy to create a benchmark for a college exam that you're testing someone on history questions or physics questions. It perhaps is a bit of a more challenging endeavor to see if you can create a benchmark for what a robot may be able to do. So that's kind of where we're at with the technology. It's getting a lot better, but I think there's questions that remain about how we actually test what it could do. And there are certain new areas of research like agentic AI that is showing a lot more promise. So that's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two, to me, is that as the technology has gotten better, AI has become increasingly embedded in everyday life. You see this in a lot of different ways. There's more FDA-approved AI-related medical devices than ever before. So AI might be coming to a doctor's office near you sometime soon. Self-driving is also on the rise. We had a self-driving section in the AI index for the first time because now you could be in a position to be in San Francisco, take a Waymo, not only in San Francisco, but in other cities like LA, Phoenix, and Austin. And data does suggest that these systems are safer than human drivers. And it's not just an American phenomenon. China has a very robust self-driving ecosystem. And there's a lot of companies like Baidu that have really been actively pushing out a lot of these AI systems. So as the tech has gotten better, we really see that the tech is a part of all of our lives a lot more. And to me, that's a really important narrative because we're no longer at a moment in which AI is something that's confined to the lab. It's something that's in all of our lives and something that we're going to have to encounter a little bit more. So I think when you kind of look at this fact that AI as a tech seems to be here a little bit more, it seems to be getting better. I think to me, the big story in the last year has just been that people across the world in different verticals are really starting to react to the technology a little bit more. That to me is the thesis of this year's report. And I think you see this first and foremost with business. Business is all in on AI. We've partnered with McKinsey to do this survey, which is asking organizations what proportion of them report using AI in at least one business function. And you'll notice that for the last few years, it kind of was plateauing around 50. And you can maybe call this the ChatGPT effect, but following 2023, we see a massive spike in the number of businesses that report using AI technology. Generative AI investment is also on the rise. We go from roughly $5 billion in generative AI investment to close to $34 billion in 2024. And when you look at what type of countries in the world actually lead on this investment, it's the United States that's far away ahead of other geographic areas like Europe and China. Now, part of the reason that I think you see a lot of businesses using this AI technology is there's now a lot of exciting research, I would say mostly coming out of the academy, that is associating AI with positive productivity impacts. So there's a study that was done by Eric Brynjolfsson, one of the AI Index steering committee members, that looked at the impact of AI on customer support agents. The agents that used AI did a lot better than those that didn't. There was a new study that looked at the impact of AI on scientific innovation. The scientists that used AI discovered more new materials, they filed more patents, and it's not just a few niche industries. These, again, are charts from previous versions of the index, but we have computer scientists that are doing things a lot quicker with AI, consultants that are more productive, more quick, do work of higher quality, lawyers as well, that also seem to show positive AI impacts. And this is really kind of a finding that we see now in multiple different areas, that at the minimum, AI usage seems to be associated with doing tasks more quickly. And at the maximum, it also seems to be associated with work of substantially higher quality. But when you kind of disentangle some of these business impacts, one of the interesting things that we seem to see in a lot of these studies has been this kind of finding that AI seems to have differential effects depending on the skill category of the worker that is given AI. So what I mean by this is that in a lot of these studies, they would give AI to the low-skilled workers, and they would give AI to the high-skilled workers. And while in most cases they found that AI did improve the performance of high-skilled workers and low-skilled workers, it improved the performance of low-skilled workers a lot more than that of high-skilled workers. It kind of equalized the playing field to a certain degree. Now, not all studies show this. You remember the study that I cited previously on scientific impact. That was one study that actually found that it was the best scientists that did a lot better with AI than the worst scientists. And that finding might seem to suggest that the impact that AI has on high versus low skilled workers might be incredibly task specific. But again, it kind of points to new avenues of research and new types of questions that we need to be asking when we think of what impact AI is going to have on the economy. Now, when you think about what impact AI is going to have on the economy, you also need to kind of ask yourself, what impact is there going to be on the labor force? I mean, I remember I was teaching a course at Stanford last summer, and I was preparing a lecture on trends in the economy. And I came across an article that was written by an employee at Anthropic, one of the leading AI labs. And the article was kind of provocatively titled, in 3 years, none of us are going to be working because AI is going to be doing everything. And that kind of made me roll my eyes a little bit because I don't think that's going to be the case. I mean, the index is a good example of this. When I started at the index, it was a team of 2 full-time individuals and a 200-page report. It's still a team of 2 full-time individuals, but the report is close to 500 pages, partially now because ChatGPT and some of these tools are helping us out in terms of what we do. But the point here is that I think when you think about AI, one of the top concerns that people kind of bring up is this concern that AI is going to take jobs away. We don't have a lot of good concrete data on this, but one of the most interesting findings to me in this year's report is this survey again from McKinsey that is asking organizational leaders what impact they think AI is going to have on organizations' workforces in the next few years. So what you see in the blue is the responses for this year, and what you see in the pink is responses to this question the previous year. Now, when this question was asked in 2023, it was close to 43% of managers, so the largest portion, that felt that AI would lead to decreases in workflows. But when this question was asked again in the last year, in 2024, it was a substantially lower amount, 32% of managers now that thought that AI would decrease workflows. So there's still a large number that thinks this is going to be the effect, but the amount of people that report this effect seems to be kind of diminishing and going down. And I mean, when I look at this data, I think about the famous kind of prediction of the British economist John Maynard Keynes. In the 1930s, he predicted that 100 years from now in 2030, we'd all be 8 times richer and all working 15-hour work weeks. The premise being that technology would make things a lot easier and more efficient for us. He was right about one of those predictions. We are actually very close to being 8 times richer, but I don't know about you. I'm not logging 15 hours of work a week. And again, this isn't to kind of trivialize these discussions about AI's labor impact, but I think the point I'm trying to make here is that at the index, we're in the business of tracking what impact AI is going to have on the economy. And I think now that we're starting to see AI used, this is an open question that we're going to have to explore. Thankfully, at Stanford, we work with a lot of great economists that can hopefully be answering those questions for us. So I'll follow up with them in a few years. So the thesis that I kind of rolled with in this presentation was AI is getting better and people across the world in different stripes are reacting. Businesses are reacting. I also think that governments in the world have also reacted very, very sharply to AI. You see this in a lot of different ways. If you look at, for example, the number of AI-related regulations in the United States that have come from regulatory agencies like the FDA, like the Commerce Department, you go from one such regulation in 2016 all the way to close to 60 in 2024. And these regulations aren't just coming from one or two regulatory agencies. So it's not just the case, for example, that the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services is the only one doing these regulations. These regulations are coming from the Executive Office of the President, from the Health and Human Services Department, from the Office of the Secretary, from the Treasury Department. AI is a general purpose technology, and it seems that regulators have also dealt with it in a rather general purpose way. Now, in the US at least, it's really been the states that I would say have been the most active on the regulation side. They have passed by and far the largest number of AI-related legislations. And again, you can kind of see the hockey stick growth here, where after ChatGPT comes up, there is a substantial rise in AI-related regulations across states, with certain states like California leading the charge. And encouragingly, perhaps, for the state of our democracy, a lot of these states are also increasingly passing laws around the usage of deep fakes in elections. You can kind of see in this map when you saw some of those laws passed. A lot of states already have these laws. Some states enacted them a long time ago, and others are still pending. And there's also now more and more legislation around the use of AI-related deepfake imagery. So we're seeing that a lot of these regulators and legislators are stepping up to AI. And it's not just an American story, it's really a global story in a lot of ways. If you look at, for example, the number of AI-related bills that have been passed into law across the world, you also see a growth from 1 in 2016 to 40 in 2024. But, again, when I gave this presentation last year, I've now worked on the index for a few years, so I kind of have this luxury of seeing how the landscape has evolved. The story was definitely there's more and more legislation. But I think to me, one of the big stories when it comes to policy this year is the fact that governments are really stepping up with investment. There are several countries across the world, whether it's Singapore, whether it's the UAE, India, Canada, China, that have all committed several billions of dollars, in some cases roughly 2.5 billion in Canada to 50 billion in China, to some kind of AI-related infrastructure project. And perhaps you kind of see this changing dialogue most succinctly in the most recent AI summit that was held in Paris. 6 months, a year before the summit was very much branded as the next AI safety summit. And the discourse now has seemed to change in the direction of AI action. Governments are really taking this AI opportunity seriously. So that's how governments and policymakers across the world are thinking about this tech. We know how businesses are also thinking about the tech. How is the regular public thinking about AI technology? This to me is also very interesting. I mean, I guess I find myself saying this is interesting for virtually every slide, but I mean, I wrote the report, so I guess I need to feel that particular way. But this, I promise you guys, is very interesting. So this is data from Ipsos that is asking countries across the world, do you agree that products and services using AI have more benefits than drawbacks? And what you see on this chart, again, kind of a mastery of visualization from Loredana, is how the responses change over years. You'll notice that for most countries in the sample, there is much more AI optimism now than there was in 2022, especially for countries like France, Germany, Belgium, the United States, Canada, these countries were once very negative about AI, and they're still pessimistic, but there's been a lot more, let's say, positive sentiment regarding this technology. Now, despite this, you still have other countries like China, Indonesia, and Thailand that have substantially higher rates of AI optimism. And those rates haven't seemed to have diminished that much over time. Now, I haven't seen good data that actually explores why this difference exists, but this is, of course, a very interesting thing to ask ourselves. Why are there differing opinions across the globe? And what might that mean for how this technology grows, develops, and changes over time? We have good data in the index as well, not only on general AI opinions, but if you look at in the United States, how many people in the United States trust self-driving cars? Well, the answer is not that many. And the trust perhaps is increasing marginally, but still 61% of Americans in 2025 report being afraid of self-driving cars, despite the fact that I showed you guys some statistics which seem to compellingly suggest that self-driving cars are a lot safer than human drivers. Now, it's not just a story of regular people thinking about the tech. There was a really good survey that we cited in this year's index, which looked at how policymakers felt about this technology. And you'll notice that when it comes to AI regulation, there is broad support among US policymakers across all stripes. Again, Democrats are a bit more excited about regulation than Republicans. But generally speaking, the majority of local policymakers in the US want AI regulation. But where it gets interesting is, again, the devil is in the details. What kind of regulations are they supporting? Some perhaps have championed solutions like UBI. Others have focused more on reskilling, data privacy. And this is, again, it seems like encouragingly, perhaps in comparison to other technological revolutions like that of social media, there has been an immediate reaction from policymakers to want to do something. But again, now the hard part actually comes figuring out what do we actually do. Now, the first few kind of highlights that I've given to you guys, and I was thinking about how to structure this presentation, how to work on this narrative, to me, they're kind of highlights that are perhaps a little bit more settled in that the tech is getting better, the people are using it more, businesses using it more, governments are reacting, public is thinking about it. The next few highlights really kind of show and speak to how the AI ecosystem is evolving and some new things that have really kind of come on the map in different ways. And one of the biggest questions is that of geopolitics, right? My father, who, still sometimes thinks I work in IT, is not really sure what AI actually is. I knew that AI had made it onto the mainstream when he was asking me about DeepSeek and what that meant when it wiped out, I think, 10-15% of the NASDAQ. There's all these questions of who is leading geopolitically, US or China. Well, it's a nuanced question. If you actually look at where most of these notable AI models are coming from, the US still has a fairly robust lead in the last year, but also since 2003. In the last 2 decades, the US has by and far produced the most notable machine learning models. We also did a really exciting analysis this year at the index where we took the top 100 most cited AI research papers in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And we tried to see what institutions they were coming from. Were they coming from US institutions, Chinese institutions, German ones? And again, you can see here that the US is still the leader here, but perhaps in the last few years, its kind of share has declined. Now, this is just looking at a few data points, but the real story, I think, on this front is that China is really closing the performance gap. So when you look at certain benchmarks like LMSIS, which are public leaderboards that evaluate how well AI models can operate, you'll notice that in January of 2024, there's roughly a 100, 150 point delta between the top US and the top Chinese model. Fast forward to February of 2025, and that delta has shrunk, and there is a very marginal difference between the top US model and the top Chinese model. There's also certain areas like just producing the greatest number of research publications that China has the lead in. China's also commanding leader in releasing AI patents. So there's a lot of kind of nuance to this question about which country is in the lead geopolitically. Fortunately, we have a tool at the AI Index called the Global AI Vibrancy Tool that ranks how well these different countries do. And I encourage you guys to check that tool out because it really succinctly summarizes the state of the ecosystem there. Now, another area where I kind of see not necessarily uncertainty, but kind of an uneven evolution is that of responsible AI. This ecosystem is really evolving in a rather uneven way. And I think to kind of say first and foremost, I mean, we show that there's kind of more AI-related incidents than ever before. And this is probably kind of undercounting these incidents because these are public reportages of AI instances. There's probably a lot of incidences that occur behind the scenes that we're not aware of. But there have been stories in 2024 of Tesla's perhaps being in the kind of self-drive function, driving in a poor way. There are stories now of these chatbots like character AI chatbots that have arguably encouraged individuals to take their own lives. Again, these tools are now being used, and the usage is coming with greater productivity. It is coming with more and more advantages, but there's important ethical things to also discuss and to be cognizant of. Now, one of the big things that we see in the RAI ecosystem is that there is really a lack of standardized benchmarking for responsible AI. So I talked about benchmarks a lot in this presentation. Benchmarks, again, are this way of actually assessing what can an AI system do. You'll notice that when it comes to general capabilities benchmarks like MMMU or GPQA, MMLU is looking at how well can these systems do college-level reasoning. GPQA is looking at how well can they do scientific reasoning. You'll notice that there is consensus for basically every single developer, every major model. They're all reporting scores on these particular benchmarks. But when you flip the script and you look at the world of responsible AI, so these are benchmarks that are now looking at how biased are these models? Are these models actually going to tell you the truth? How vulnerable are they to adversarial attacks? You'll notice that there is really no consensus. Some developers are testing on some benchmarks, others still on others. Now, this is something that we reported on in last year's AI Index, and it's not something that really has changed that much in the last year. Now, it's not to say that these developers aren't doing RAI work. I mean, all of these companies have teams that are thinking about the risks of some of these models, but they're doing it in different ways. They're kind of all doing their own tests and not doing a standardized set of tests. And of course, if you're an organization or a business that is thinking about using these tools, you now might need to do some of the work yourself if you really want to know in a standardized way how performance varies and changes on one benchmark to another. Now, encouragingly, in this kind of absence, a lot of academics really have stepped up this year. So a lot of good research coming out of this very building. There have been organizations like CRFM that have released benchmarks like Helm Safety and AirBench that are actually trying to do this work on a comprehensive level, trying to understand which models are the safest, which models perhaps are the best to use, the least vulnerable to adversarial attacks. And on the business side, we still find that a lot of businesses are very early in their RAI journey. If you look at survey data that is asking businesses, what AI-related risks do you consider to be relevant versus what risks are you taking steps to actively mitigate, there is a substantial delta between the risks that they report as being relevant and the risks that they are actually taking steps to mitigate. There is not as much mitigation as, let's say, a considerance of relevant risks. And also the kind of RAI concerns that businesses have are also changing. We partnered with Accenture to do this particular survey. And this is looking at how relevant selected RAI risks are for organizations in 2025 versus 2024. And you'll notice that there are certain risks like privacy and data related risks, reliability risks. They seem to top the leaderboard and they seem to kind of attract the most salience. But if you notice, one of the risks that's seen the greatest increase is financial risks. The kind of possibility that using AI might be associated with some kind of low ROI, or there's some kind of AI-related financial loss. And this kind of aligns with some other data that McKinsey has shared with us that has shown that while a lot of organizations report using AI, a lot of these organizations are still very early on in their AI journey and still really trying to figure out how to make sense of this tech. Now, encouragingly, again, speaking to the kind of uneven evolution of our AI, policymakers have really risen to the occasion on this front. There have been a number of notable RAI policymaking milestones in the last year, coming from organizations like the OECD, the Council of Europe, the African Union, the G7, all of which are trying to institutionalize and formalize some RAI-related topics and issues. So that's kind of another area of, let's say, kind of mixed and differential developments. And this next one is also kind of an interesting trend. And I remember when I was speaking to media on behalf of the index, this trend, it led to some questions about perhaps this trend being a little bit paradoxical. But on the one hand, one of the things that we see in the last year is that AI has become a lot more accessible, yet industry continues to lead for various reasons. So regarding accessibility, you see this in a lot of different ways. So first and foremost, there are falling inference prices. What you see on this particular chart is how much does it cost to use AI systems, to query them, based on a set level of intelligence. So the chart that you want to look at and the line that you want to look at in this chart is going to be that for GPT 3.5, the blue line on the far left. This is looking at how much does it cost to use a model on the level of GPT 3.5, which was one of the models that served as a backbone for the first version of ChatGPT. And you'll notice that the cost of that model goes from roughly $20 per million tokens in November of 2022, all the way to 7 cents per million tokens in November of 2024. And you see this also across differing and more challenging intellectual domains. And of course, cheaper models mean more accessible models and a more accessible technology. And part of the reason that you have these cheaper models is because we're getting smaller and smaller models that are delivering at a fairly high rate. This chart is showing you the smallest model that scores above a 60% on MMLU, a very popular AI benchmark. And you'll notice that we go from models that roughly have 500 billion parameters. Again, for those unfamiliar, parameters are kind of a proxy of how big the model is, how much data it's been trained on, how much compute it requires. We go from models that are around 500 billion parameters to models that are, as of May 2024, delivering that performance at a parameter level of 4 billion, a massive decrease in this time period. And part of the reason that you see this is you have better performing hardware. This chart is looking at the price performance of leading NVIDIA data center GPUs. And you can kind of see how much compute you are getting per second per dollar. And you can see the massive difference between the H100, which came out in 2022, and say the A100, which came out in 2020. And I believe the P100, which was 2016 or 2015, these hardware components have gotten massively more robust. And in the process, AI training has become much more efficient. Another story here is that open weight models are also getting a lot better, right? For those that are unfamiliar, you can release these AI models in a closed way where you just use the API infrastructure, or some developers will train the models and then release the weights openly. So you can freely modify it, you can run it locally. Openness tends to come with more accessibility and transparency. When we did the AI index last year, one of the big stories was that open weight models really lagged behind in performance with closed weight models. So if you were a business potentially having to make an executive decision as to which model you build with, there were real trade-offs to be made about, do you go with something that's more open, more transparent, more controllable, or something that's better but closed? Now, that issue isn't as salient. Again, on some of these benchmarks like LMSIS, there is a real narrowing in the gap of performance between the top closed and the top open weight models. So on the one hand, we have this greater accessibility. We have cheaper models, smaller models, models that are using less compute, hardware that is getting better. This all is a signal towards AI as a technology being used a lot more. But we still have this story that industry is really racing ahead in AI. this chart is looking at the number of notable AI models that come from different industrial affiliations. And you'll notice that until 2014, most of these models, they came from universities. Since then, a massive gap has opened up. And in 2024, there were 55 notable models that came from industry. And by our tally, 0 that came from academic institutions. And if you look at since 2014, the organizations that are producing the most systems, again, they're all industrial labs like Google, Meta, Microsoft, and OpenAI. And the reason that industry players are leading is really, I think, visualized on this chart, that it is costing very large sums of money to train these AI systems. And what we see on this chart, again, this is research that we pioneered with Epoch AI, is the estimated training cost of select AI models. And you go from models that cost around $700 in 2017 to models that in 2021, 2020 are costing $4 to $6 mil, to models in the last year, 2024, that are costing anywhere from $40 to $170 million. That's a lot of money, and even more money than a lot of notable universities can afford. And the real story here, and I think this is one of the big kind of observations of the AI revolution in the last 5 years, is just one of massively increasing compute costs. A lot of these language models, they're built off of this transformer architecture. You can kind of conceptualize the transformer almost as a new way of designing or building an AI system. When it was discovered in 2017 by researchers at Google, a few years after, researchers at other companies like OpenAI found out that, hey, if you take this architecture, you take this way of building an AI system, and you pump more and more data into it, you get massively improved performance. And in a lot of ways, that's what these developers have been doing. Now, of course, when you pump more data into these systems, you need more computational resources because the system is doing more learning. And when computational resources go up, the cost of using a lot of these models goes up. Now, there's interesting questions about whether this trend is going to continue. On the one hand, I think a lot of these companies have said we're going to continue to scale. There have even been provocative statements made by the CEOs of some of these AI labs that models are soon going to cost $500 million to $1 billion in terms of training cost. But on the other hand, some of these new developments like that of DeepSeek really illustrate that you can get intelligence at perhaps a price tag that is a lot lower than we once thought. So I think this is a very interesting trend and thing to think about. Are we going to kind of continue seeing this kind of push for scale? Or perhaps are we going to see more of a priority on building smaller, more robust, fine-tuned models? Now, I kind of threw this slide in yesterday to kind of make a point like, okay, yes, AI systems are getting cheaper, but to use frontier models still remains very expensive. And the point that I wanted to make here was that, like, yeah, you can now get cheaper models, but the best models, the state-of-the-art models, are still going to be very expensive. But then I was kind of looking at this slide, and I mean, O1 is very expensive to use, but DeepSeek's R1 is a very powerful model that is costing roughly $2 per million tokens. And again, DeepSeek's R1 is way better than the first ChatGPT that came out. And as we discussed earlier, that model cost $20. This one costs $2. So yes, frontier intelligence is more expensive, but again, we see these continuing kind of cost trends. But the frontier of AI is also becoming a lot more competitive than ever. Now, industry is dominating, but in 2022, there was maybe a few players, Google, OpenAI, that were really in a position to develop these high-quality models. Since then, that gap has really closed, and we're kind of now in an ecosystem where there are 7 developers, Google, OpenAI, DeepSeek, xAI, Anthropic, Meta, Mistral, all of which create really high-quality models. And I think there's a very open question as to who is going to win this race from a business perspective. Of course, some models are better suited for some purposes than others, but it's going to be now interesting to see when companies make decisions to use AI and to build with this tech, which business are they going to choose? Now, I talked about how industry is leading the charge. I mean, it's important to kind of note that academics are still very well represented. If you look at, again, top 100 AI publications, most of these publications still come from the academy, and not as many are coming from industry. And this is, again, there's a lot to be said about this, but a lot of these very foundational AI innovations like AlexNet using GPUs to accelerate AI, they came out of university settings. And they're now being used by industry to kind of drive these massive profits. And increasingly, we're looking at an ecosystem where industry is contributing less and less open research. And I think this says less about the quality of research in industry, but more about the fact that there are now competitive concerns. If you read, for example, the GPT-3 paper, it very openly discusses how the model was built, what assumptions were being made, what kind of decisions were made as part of the process. It was a very openly scientific paper. But when you flip to the GPT-4 paper, the researchers very openly say that due to competitive concerns, we're not going to reveal that much information about how we build these systems. And in fact, funnily enough, our job at the index is to collect information on how well these models do on different benchmarks. And I remember joking with my team that historically the way that we would do this is by reading papers that the developers would release that would have this information. We're kind of now at a moment in the ecosystem where models are being released on blog posts. And for one of the top models that OpenAI had, O3, we saw all this discussion about the best score that O3 posted, and we couldn't find the paper, let alone the blog post that verified the score. And that's because there was none. The model was released on a YouTube video, and the scores were just posted there. So that kind of illustrates in a lot of ways how the landscape in the ecosystem has changed. A few more highlights for you guys, and then we'll leave it to questions. We partnered this year with the Kapoor Foundation to release an excellent chapter on AI in education. And we found interesting trends that you do see expanding AI education across the world. There are some countries which make computer science education mandatory, other countries where it's in some districts, but there are disparities. We're kind of at a very unlevel playing field when you look at this data, despite the fact that there are more and more computer science graduates globally, especially in the United States. And perhaps most concerningly, if you actually look at data from teachers, most teachers, or a very large number, do not feel prepared to teach students on the K-12 level about AI technology. And again, if AI is going to be something that all of us are going to use, that's going to impact all of our life, beyond just kind of teaching how to build these systems, we need to teach people how to interact with these systems, what the ethical concerns are, what the trade-offs are. And our research suggests that we're still far away from doing that. Now, the last thing that I'll kind of conclude the presentation off with is kind of, open discussions about challenges that remain in the ecosystem. Because it's very easy to kind of present about AI and to kind of think, well, these guys, the numbers are going up, AI is kind of doing super well, everything is good. Hopefully, I've kind of convinced you guys that there's a lot of elements to be excited about. The tech is getting better, people are using it more, but there are concerns about what impact it's going to have on the labor force, how people are using it from RAI perspectives. But even on the technological front, we have to kind of acknowledge that complex reasoning still remains a challenge. There's a really good benchmark that we like to feature in the report, which looks at how well systems can do planning. And in this benchmark, these systems are kind of tasked to move around different blocks. Planning, of course, is a very essential component of human intelligence. And a lot of these traditional models like GPT-4o and Gemini 1.5, they struggled on this benchmark. Now, encouragingly, these new reasoning models like O1, they've done a lot better. But even still on these kinds of subvariants of the benchmark like mystery blocks world, where there are certain things that are obfuscated or taken away, performance doesn't seem to be kind of as strong, as capable, and as potent. And I think I'll kind of conclude the presentation with that. There's a QR code of the report, just in case some of you guys do want to humor me and read the full thing front to back. We can kind of start an AI Index fan club meeting. But we're kind of at a moment in the ecosystem where this technology is here. It's affecting all of our lives. And I think we kind of want to honestly assess what we could do with it and where we're going to go with it. And I think that kind of speaks to the mission at the index. We're not trying to tell you to do this with the technology or to do that with the technology. I think at our core, we really believe this could be one of the most impactful technologies of the 21st century. But if this technology is going to be used well by people, by universities, by businesses to really elevate the potential of technology, we need to give people the right kind of information and the right kind of tools to make the right decisions about it. So thank you very much, guys, for your time, and looking forward to getting grilled with some questions.
So first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was awesome. And I just had a quick question about the forecasts regarding employment. Were those 30-something% of managers who estimated a decrease, were they thinking about headcount allocated to current roles, or were they also thinking about new roles that might get defined as a consequence of AI?
I think they were looking at it in a broad sense. So kind of not necessarily making that distinction, but like, I think kind of imagining to themselves, like in 5 years or in 3 years, are you going to have more people or less people as a result of the technology net? But I mean, it's interesting, right? And this is something, as much as we do all this work with the AI index, and I mean, I'm sure that Ray, Loredana, the rest of the team would also echo this. You kind of get data for some points, but then you find yourself really saying, I wish I had data for others. And that would be something really interesting to see how our workforce is changing as a result of this tech, and are the sizes changing and evolving? Because I think you could imagine compelling reasons for there to be downsizing. Like I think Duolingo announced a few days ago that it's going to replace its contract workers with AI. But also you can imagine some forward-thinking companies really thinking to themselves, you know, we're going to automate half of our work, but then get those workers to do things that we couldn't even do before. So there's an open question as to how that particular space is going to trend.
Hi, Cameron Turner from Truify AI. Most of the data that you showed was from 2024. I'm wondering what stories you're tracking for 2025, and are there any surprises, or can you give us a sneak peek about what we'll hear a year from now?
That is a good question. I think it depends, again, who you speak to. I think for me, one of the very interesting things to kind of see is, what is the business impact of this tech going to be? Because you'll notice that I showed you a lot of slides about AI having positive ROI. That's kind of, that productivity impact is being looked at specifically in business settings that are very academic. It's like small academic experiments. But I would love to know on a kind of much broader and wider scale, you know, like in a big business or a big company that's using the tool, how is ROI changing and how is that kind of evolving? I also think it's going to be very interesting to see now how we go from kind of, let's say, technology to usage. And what I mean by that is, you know, I talked about the frontier getting a lot more competitive. There's now, you know, 6, 7 developers that offer very similar technology in terms of capability. But technological usage and adoption isn't always about who has the best tech, but it's sometimes more about who has the most usable tech. And I do wonder, what is that usability going to look like? Are we still going to be using chatbots in 2 years? Are there going to be new learning interfaces? Who's going to kind of crack the code to find a way to kind of get AI into more people's hands? And I think that's still very much an open question. And I think in a lot of ways, if you look at like the genius of ChatGPT, it was, I think, less about like releasing that tech because that tech was already existed. It was more about kind of creating this chatbot. And I think the chatbot with that tech really showed to a lot of people what AI could do. And I wonder what the next frontier is going to look like there. And I think maybe last thing is, you know, we spoke to some of these challenges in regards to reasoning and planning. You know, I wonder if there's going to be new model architectures that are going to be developed to try to overcome some of them.
Well, okay, there we go. I'm going to pop in with a paraphrased question from Slido. So what are some of the things that the public may not be aware of, whether it's strengths or weaknesses about current AI models? What are those elements that are either misunderstood or not sort of brought to the fore in terms of strengths and weaknesses of the current models?
That's a good question. I mean, I think we try to do kind of like a balanced account of what these systems can do. I think what kind of I would say is that, and again, it kind of comes back to the benchmarking piece, that I think, you know, if you're using AI models, you know, we've all kind of used ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, and we can see what they do. I think you need to kind of ask yourself critically and intentionally, how you're trying to evaluate whether the models can do what you want them to do. And I think this is maybe, you know, the public can kind of see on some of these benchmarks what the tech can do, but a lot of the benchmarks that we have to actually test a lot of these models, they're very academic benchmarks. They're benchmarks that, again, are kind of looking at how well can these systems do grade 8 math? How well can they classify images? How well can they do university chemistry problems. But a lot of businesses aren't doing grade 8 math or university chemistry problems. They're doing things like copy editing, proofreading, generating invoices, matching those invoices to Excel sheets. And, different models might have different kind of capabilities or strengths when it comes to that. So I think that's kind of one thing. I think, the benchmarks, as useful as they are to kind of tell us what these models can do intellectually, I think there's a separate question of how do you figure out the best model for your business? And I think kind of second, I would also say that there is, I think sometimes an assumption that like businesses are, really all in on this tech and the productivity gains are coming. I think if you look at the history of technological revolutions, so for example, the introduction of the electric motor or the personal computer, economists estimate there typically tends to be a delta of a few decades before the positive productivity impacts of the technology are realized. Because businesses, when they see a new technology, they need to change the way they work. They need to figure out how to use it. If you were a factory owner in the 1850s and everything was built on steam and electricity just came around, you couldn't just retrofit the factory to be electric. You needed to change the way you did everything to get better use of the tech. And I still think a lot of people maybe overestimate how advanced businesses are in their AI journey. I still think we're at a moment where a lot of these businesses, even some of the big ones, are really trying to kind of figure out how to get positive value from this tech. Is that a question, Ray, or do you have a comment to add to that? Yeah. Do you want to Ray's the co-chair of the index, so brilliant AI minds.
So my sense about the future use is a lot of it has to do with reliability of what these systems do. And, we all know, and it shows up in the report and so on, these systems still hallucinate. And the reasoning point that Nestor brought up at the end, I think is part of the same story. When you're using these systems in some circumstances, you damn well expect that what you should expect that what you're going to get is correct. And that's in very few settings now something that So the big challenge, I think, from a business point of view is what can you do with the technology in its current state and its evolving state, and how do you deal with the imperfections of the results that you're going to get?
I'm the nominated vice chair for the AI for Good Impact for the UN. I think I'm very interested in how the industry research is going well ahead. But it seems to me there's a place for academic research which brings all of the humanities. And a place like Stanford and the other academic institutions could be actually looking at AI good for what? Your comments.
So are you kind of asking about like how we should prioritize research or be thinking about research?
Actually, I'm asking, are you cooperating with the humanities, with social sciences, with medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a few things. So I'll kind of answer on behalf of HI and then the AI Index. So, I mean, HI is an organization that has this kind of interdisciplinary focus built into its fundamental mission. So, we collaborate with lawyers, doctors, artists to kind of figure out how AI is going to impact. And I think we'd love to kind of do the same thing at the AI Index. Like in an ideal world, we'd have a chapter on AI and art, kind of AI and language. There's only so much our team can do, but that's kind of one of the amazing things with the tech. And also one of the scary things is that it can really have such a wide-ranging impact. But we do try to kind of emphasize that from the get-go. And I think we're always really intentional at the index to try to find ways to kind of get new data and to get new information. And if any of you guys have data that you think would be relevant or feel that, hey, there's maybe something in the report that we're really missing, just shoot us an email and we'd be more than happy to consider that.
Thank you. Great presentation. Following up on the question about the employment, what can be done to the questions that are being asked to tease out these nuances in more detail? I think, we've seen companies say, hey, we're not hiring any but software engineers this year, like Salesforce. And even in the charts today, we saw People are applying AI to some things already, and some of the countries that have a lot of, say, offshore work, like India and Poland, are deep in the red already. So I'm just curious if you could comment on, what could be done perhaps going forward so we can sort of anticipate predicted changes based on not just the people I have on my staff now, but what am I going to hire tomorrow? Not maybe in 5 years, but in the next 12 months.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the AI index, we wouldn't really have an opinion on that because I think we're just trying to look at some of these trends. I would say kind of as an individual that is thinking about AI, I mean, for me, it's kind of trying to actually understand what those trends are and kind of acting on that information. Now, that seems like a very obvious thing, but I think when I look at the history of a lot of AI prognostication, it is a field that kind of invites a lot of this kind of looking into the future about where things might be and how they might develop. But very often the things that we predict don't actually end up happening. And I think a good example of this is I remember when I was a master's student, I was doing a lot of political science reading, economics reading, and we would read all of this information on economists predicting the impact that automation would have on jobs and also then democracy. And in all of these papers, the assumptions basically were that as the tech would get better, the first jobs that it would come for would be, people flipping burgers at a McDonald's or cleaning a toilet, these kind of routine manual jobs. If you actually fast forward a decade, we now have this tech ChatGPT, these language models that could arguably do the work that some lawyers do or maybe some doctors do. And there have been advances in robotics, but building a robot that could reliably do the work of a minimum wage worker at McDonald's, I feel like we're still quite far away from that, right? So we kind of anticipated one thing, but we got something else. So for me, I think I would love to see a world in which there just is a lot of better measurement about some of these things. So actually kind of understanding, is AI leading to kind of less jobs or more jobs? What sectors are the most effective? Maybe how do we kind of reconceptualize reskilling workers? What sectors need reskilling? I think that it's a challenge because the space is moving so quickly, but we do need to have kind of institutes that are good at doing the measurements so that we could actually kind of inform what is happening. Because for all we know, maybe AI isn't going to lead to this massive labor loss, but it could as well. But if we don't know what effect it's going to have, we can't even take any steps in the right direction.
Hi, I'm Seth Fury, formerly with Hewlett-Packard Laboratories. One of the barriers to adoption by industry has been legal liability. And I'm wondering where we stand on that. If, for example, a law firm generates a contract that proves to be flawed, who is liable and how can the LLM be questioned as to how it did its reasoning and developed it? Are we making progress in that area? How are we doing?
Yeah, so I wouldn't know the answer to that specific question, but kind of my intuition, having looked at some of the legislation and regulation, is that it is kind of a field that is evolving very quickly and one that there isn't a lot of, I think, kind of concrete answers. And I think you see this in a couple of different ways. I mean, I think there's a lot of ongoing lawsuits against companies like OpenAI and Anthropic claiming that they basically stole data and they use the data to kind of train these systems. And I think the jury is still out, no pun intended, on what effect, how the courts are going to kind of rule on some of these different questions. I also kind of remember reading the EU AI Act when it first came out. And I remember my first reaction when I read it was just thinking to myself, this is going to give lawyers a lot of work for the next 3 decades because it was so not necessarily vaguely written, but there was a lot of things that were very open to interpretation. And you can imagine legal teams duking it out in court. So I think a lot of the stuff is unfortunately unsettled. And I mean, that's tricky for businesses, right? Because on the one hand, businesses, you see some of these charts and you think to yourself like, hey, I should be using AI, it can make a big difference. But then on the other hand, if you don't know what the regulation is or you use AI and you maybe have a bit of a mishap because AI hallucinates or you don't know what some of the responsibility risks are, you could potentially land yourself in even hotter water. So it's a very tricky and kind of, let's say, particular space to navigate in.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. Could you attempt an explanation about how China is closing the performance gap, even though US is leading in research and investment?
Well, I mean, China has always had a very robust kind of AI academic ecosystem. I mean, they've always kind of led in terms of the number of papers, the number of AI patents. So it's not the case that they've kind of come out from nowhere. I think there's a really strong, robust foundation. I think also, I mean, this is a story of research, right? When research is done, it kind of diffuses and spreads. And I think in certain cases with AI, there's reports that, for example, Llama and some of these other open source models were used as inspiration by some of these developers in China, the Quens and the DeepSeeks, to actually make some of these systems. So I think people kind of learn from each other and they kind of develop some of this technology. But again, I think that the DeepSeek innovation is less about kind of creating a totally new way to build a model, and it's just more about making something a lot more efficient and kind of high performing. And I think that requires a different level of kind of thought and innovation than necessarily creating a completely new architecture from scratch. I see Ray has a comment as well.
I have another hunch about an element of this. We talk about China producing more publications than the US or Europe do. And in the case of the ratio is currently, I think, 2.3 times over the last year. Now, I take that not just as about publications, but as about people. Roughly, it takes roughly so many people to produce a publication. And I think you can extrapolate from that the Chinese are training and employ, roughly 2.3 times as many researchers in this area as the US does. And that's not counting, the students that come to the US and go back, could get trained in the US and go back. So this research manpower is an issue that we are going to try to be able to say something more clearly about. But I think it's critical.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I've been a passionate reader of AI Index report for the last 6 years, and I'm happy to be here today. Since that, I'm working as AI strategist, and since that 6 years, the work of my team has changed significantly. And that's why just due to the change of the technologies and how we work with consulting projects. And I wanted to ask you and your team how your work has been changed for that time, for these 7 years while you're doing this report.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think that, again, like the report is a lot bigger. We're doing a lot more and we still have the same amount of resources. I think part of that is we've become a lot more efficient. We kind of figure out how to make things run a little bit quicker. But I mean, I use AI a lot to kind of copy edit, to kind of generate ideas. There's now these kind of functions on OpenAI for like deep research and an opportunity to kind of really navigate the landscape. So there are tools that like they're very good and I would find kind of very helpful for certain things that we need to do. And I mean, also like at the index, like, we need to write prose, but we're not trying to sell like a Pulitzer Prize novel. So I don't think there is kind of a need to, be incredibly inventive in the language that we use. We have more of a responsibility to communicate clearly, crystally, and directly. And that's something that AI is really good for. So it's definitely something our team kind of uses a lot. I think we're also trying to experiment with some research projects where we're using AI to classify papers, analyze contracts. So it's definitely improved the caliber and quality of the work that we do. All right, I think that's it. So thank you guys. Have a good one.